couple. His first, College Football and American Culture in the Cold War Era, published by the University of Illinois Press in 2009, followed in 2020 by Before March Madness, The Wars for the Soul of College Basketball, also from the same press. And he's here to speak to us today about legend, myth, and civil rights, Bear Bryant, Sam Cunningham, and the game that won't die, September 1970. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kurt Kemper.
Well, thank you. As academics, we get invited to these things, and the fear amongst all of us, most of us are fairly insecure, honestly, that it's going to be three people and our mother who shows up. So I'm already gratified by how many of you are here today. I'm often sort of labeled, because it's convenient, as a sports historian, and most of us who work in that sort of bristle at that because, again, it's the insecurity. It's sort of that diminutive title that we work in something that is somehow less than significant. And I sort of own that label, but I like to think of myself as a cultural historian. And in that regard, I'm looking at sports in the same way we might look at text, film, literature. One of the things that annoys my mother, actually, to no end, is I don't really look at games. I really don't care about the outcome of athletic contests. I'm trying to focus often on what games say about us. As a cultural historian, I'm an audience response guy. And so I like to see what values people see reflected in their games. And in that regard, it allows us to get into some often highly contested areas of American society. And in particular, I write an awful lot about race, and that's what drew me to this subject today. And I will, just as a sort of a forewarning, there's a couple of references to some racially charged language in this. These are direct quotes. I've exercised them as much as possible to avoid gratuity, but just be aware that it's going to show up on a couple of occasions. On September 12, 1970, the integrated University of Southern California beat the all-white football team of the University of Alabama in Birmingham by the score of 42-21. USC's offense featured an all-black backfield who accounted for all of USC's touchdowns that night. And amidst these facts, however, has emerged some really cringeworthy myths, some dubious interpretations, and bald-faced inaccuracies, all of which has coalesced over the years to create a legend, the persistence of which reveals an ongoing conflict over the memory of the civil rights movement. The legend of the game and its consequences reflect a populist consensus that is remarkably immune to scholarly correction. Retellings of the game render it as a balancing of some cosmic ledger in the deliverance of racial harmony. It's a triumphalist narrative, largely absent conflict. This prevailing of righteousness, however, comes within a very singular moment, creating a definitive point of departure from an older, repudiated Southern order. In looking at this legend, then, it's a little bit history, it's a little bit literary criticism, and it's a little bit psychoanalysis. In focusing on the agency of Alabama head coach Paul Bear Bryant and the acceptance of integration by white Southerners, writers and commentators of the legend comfortably interpret the game as not only justice realized, but as a transition largely without cost, accountability, or even discomfiture. The legend of the 1970 game sees the resolution of Southern college football's racial segregation as a contestation between whites who play the hero, the sidekick, and the heel of our story. It is a legend that largely excludes blacks as anything other than objects and plot devices, confusing white acceptance of black college football players with white acceptance of the civil rights movement. The willingness of so many to find comfort in the legend and its attendant myths reveals the unease in accepting the legacy of Jim Crow discrimination and the direct action necessary to dismantle it. This is a story not about what happened in Birmingham in September of 1970, but about how and why so many want to think about what happened in a certain way. In the 1960s, few college football teams enjoyed the sustained success of the Alabama Crimson Tide. They won national championships in 61, 64, and 65, and posted an 84-11-2 record from 1960 to 1968. Many Southern whites saw the Tide's football successes as a counterbalance for the national condemnation the region received in the national media. As one Southern partisan noted, when Bama went north, east, and west, it wasn't going just to play a football game, it was going on a crusade. And Bear Bryant was our Richard the Lionhearted. Bear was our best, and our best could and did beat the best of anyone anywhere else. Football success was one of two things most Americans thought about when they thought about the state of Alabama at the time. The other, of course, was its brutally discriminatory practices towards its black citizens, laid before the world stage time and again in the form of race-related violence, abetted by its avowedly segregationist governor George Wallace and the gleefully racist Birmingham Police Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor. Though many Alabamians viewed the Crimson Tide's football success as an antidote to this national condemnation, Alabama football was never really able to outrun its linkages to the rantings of Wallace and the violence of Connor. In 1961, Alabama was actually invited to the Rose Bowl to play UCLA, but in the wake of the Freedom Rides earlier that year, LA media and UCLA students howled in protest and threatened to boycott the Rose Bowl. Such was promising such an embarrassing reception for the Crimson Tide at Pasadena that university officials embarrassingly were forced to turn down the invitation. 2 years later, Connor planned to house armed protesters from the infamous 1963 Birmingham demonstrations by erecting barbed wire cages in the city-owned Legion Field, where the Tide often played its home games. Jefferson County Sheriff Mel Bailey declared rather bluntly, "It's not going to look pretty on television. It's going to look like a concentration camp." If, as the New York Times asserted, Birmingham was indeed, quote, hell on earth, the Johannesburg of the South, then Bull Connor intended to make the Crimson Tide's home stadium its Robben Island. And then in 1966, Alabama enjoyed the only unbeaten, untied record in all of major college football, but was relegated to third place in the wire service polls that determined the national championship then, with many observers agreeing that the national writers refused to countenance Alabama's segregated roster and its segregated schedule. Crimson Tide fortunes began to decline slightly in 1967 and then markedly in 69 and 70. Alabama went 12-10-1 in 69 and 70, losing almost as many games in 2 years as Bryant had lost in the previous 9. While Alabama's on-field success declined, Southern states and their institutions of higher education were engaged in the slow and difficult process of integration. And while the University of Alabama integrated in 1963, its football team remained all white for the remainder of the decade, even while other members of the Southeastern Conference integrated theirs. Many commentators at the time and since have linked Alabama's football decline to its inability or unwillingness to recruit black players. The pace of and stimuli forcing the integration of Alabama football remains a central point of contention when we think about this 1970 game. Without any definitive documentary evidence, it's generally presumed that the long shadow of George Wallace and his virulently racist and populist base of supporters, either legitimately or artificially, depending on one's perspective, constrained Bryant's ability or willingness to integrate the SEC's most prominent football team. And just as the source of Alabama's football persistence of segregation remains opaque, the impetus for its integration remains similarly shrouded. It is upon these two foundational uncertainties that the populist legends about the 1970 game have found such fertile ground in which to take root. The story of the game contains two parallel and almost never intersecting tracks. The first, examined by scholars and academics, sees the game as part of a much larger process of desegregating Southern college football that took place across the better part of 3 decades, involving an often tumultuous mix of courageous pioneers, activist student bodies, increasingly conscientious media, and threatened or actual litigation. At Alabama specifically, the Crimson Tide hosted integrated SEC opponents by the end of the 1960s, and not only did they often lose, but to opponents with players who had grown up in the state of Alabama but left. And the final step of integrating the football team was forced, at least in part, by a lawsuit brought against the university by the school's own Afro-American Student Association in 1969, which included forcing Bryant to sit rather uncomfortably for a deposition on his recruiting practices. Eventually, Bryant landed Wilbur Jackson in the fall of 1970, who was thus already on the football team by the time this game took place, but because freshmen were then ineligible by NCAA rules, he wasn't in the game and, in fact, was sitting in the student section that night. While the USC defeat was undeniably a bitter wake-up call for Tide fans, it is the second track of general interest writers, the popular and sports media, and many within the game of college football itself that is the focus of this legend that I'm looking at. The most elaborate and persistent version of the 1970 game in this second track is that Bryant, desperate either to force Wallace's hand or to convince Alabama's white fan base, purposely scheduled the home game against a superior integrated team. This reading into Bryant's thinking further posits that Bryant knew he would lose, preferably badly, to a team with dominant black players in front of the predominantly white home crowd to impose upon their consciousness that if they wanted to continue watching victorious Alabama football, it was going to have to be integrated Alabama football. Embellished versions of the legend also include supposedly a satisfied Bryant, supposedly smiling after the 42-21 defeat, thanking USC head coach John McKay at midfield for the favor he had supposedly done Bryant by administering the integrated beating. The most outlandish versions also claim that after the game, Bryant went into the USC locker room to congratulate the Trojans and USC running back Sam Cunningham, who had scored 3 touchdowns, and then to take him into the Alabama locker room to announce to his team, this is what a football player looks like. This is a man. The most emphatic versions of this also capitalize or embolden the words this or man to emphasize Bryant's alleged intentions. And then to establish a clear, singular significance of the game, most versions finish by noting a quote of varying specificity and attributed to varying individuals that, quote, Sam Cunningham did more for integration in 4 quarters than Martin Luther King did in 20 years. It is from this narrative that a persistent legend emerges, relying on common tropes and motifs, burdened by myths and fabrications, and trading on the coded language that persists in America's contemporary dialogue on race. Many retellings of the game begin with some reference to the oppressive weather in Birmingham that September night. On the game's 50th anniversary, an ESPN retrospective on its weekly pregame show College Game Day asserted, quote, the air was thick with heat and humidity. A 2009 Wall Street Journal piece examined the 1970 game in detail and began with the line, it was a hot and humid September evening at Birmingham's Legion Field. Similarly, in its 30th anniversary retrospective of the game, the Los Angeles Times described the weather as, quote, hot and sultry. In fact, the temperature was 82 degrees at kickoff, with a relative humidity of less than 50%. Even the visiting USC players omit any discussion of cramping, exhaustion, or general discomfiture. So then why do we mention the weather? The frequent references to the weather that night help establish a cultural context of white Southern racial oppression. The popular linkage of Southern climate with racial oppression during the period first emerged in popular culture with the publication of John Ball's 1969-1965 novel, In the Heat of the Night, which trades in now classic motifs of racist, inept Southern law enforcement looking to railroad an innocent black man. 2 years later, it turned it into an Academy Award-winning film starring Sidney Poitier. The title of both the film and the novel and its subject matter then fit neatly within a well-known context of civil rights events. The August 1955 lynching of Emmett Till included graphic photos and descriptions of the boy's bloated body pulled from the Tallahatchie River in its ripening stench in the Mississippi heat. Demonstrators who took part in the summer 1961 freedom rides and who faced incarceration for their efforts often mentioned how heat made fetid county jails and Mississippi's notorious Parchman Penitentiary even more insufferable. In some of the most iconic representations of Southern state-sponsored racial violence, images of the 1963 Birmingham demonstrations showed sweat-stained law enforcement officers confronting black demonstrators with clubs and police dogs. In the minds of a national cultural audience, Southern heat and humidity now operated as a trope for Southern racial injustice. As a result, without any compelling alternative reason to reference the weather in Birmingham that night, these populist chroniclers have applied this trope to establish a dramatic setting for the game, rhetorically dripping from the oppression of the South's racial past. Another element of this is in addition to Southern weather, serving as code for the region's history of racial injustice, retellings of the game also rely on allusions to the legacy of Southern lynching. Stephen Travers, author of one of several book-length monographs on the game, asserts that there was a palpable tension among USC players, fearful that enraged racist white fans might rush the field to engage in an orgy of violence. As kickoff neared, USC players supposedly looked with growing concern at the stadium, filling, quote, with menacing Tide fans, standing, getting rowdier by the minute at the prospect of facing USC's integrated lineup. ESPN's 50th anniversary retrospective note that Cunningham's father, himself a refugee of Southern segregation, was silent for a few moments when his son informed him they would play in Birmingham that fall before finally uttering, "Don't do anything stupid while you're there." Still, other players brought weapons, including at least one firearm. USC linebacker John Papadakis, who is white, claims that the hotel marquee where the students stayed read, "Welcome USC Trojans," but that the allegedly tense environment was such, according to Papadakis, quote, "it might as well have read, 'Welcome USC niggers.'" Any feeling of anxiety by USC's black players was not without context. The willingness of some white Southerners to engage in deadly violence to uphold segregation remains one of the most striking elements of the civil rights era. Indeed, some of the most notorious violence was aimed at children and college-age students, many of them non-Southerners. The 1955 lynching of 14-year-old Chicago resident Emmett Till in Mississippi, and the deaths of 4 young girls in the 1963 bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church were some of the most tragic of the period. Closer to the age of the USC students were the untold numbers of college students, some of whom came from Southern California universities, who faced ferocious beatings and intimidation in the 1961 Freedom Rides. And the 1964 Freedom Summer Campaign witnessed the execution murders of 21-year-old Mississippian James Chaney and New Yorkers Andy Goodman and Michael Schwerner. It was this context that made almost any suggestion of violence against youthful blacks and outsiders seem plausible. For writers positing the game as a confrontation between the South's past and its future, highlighting the fear of USC's players and their willingness to arm themselves elevates the game to an exalted chapter in the story of the civil rights confrontations, marking the outcome of the game appear as some triumph over the South's violent racial past. Having dispensed with the scene setting, most populist retellings of the game then get to the main protagonist, Alabama head coach Paul Bear Bryant. For some, Bryant was an unchallenged legend, a lion in the profession who lorded over college football, quote, like an Old Testament Jehovah, in the words of Southern writer Willie Morris. Historian David Briley has noted that while Bryant did not think the state of Alabama was ready for integrated football, on the other hand, Bryant was the one coach in the South who could have bucked the system and integrated in the mid-'60s. So enthralled with college football's success were white Southerners, according to this interpretation, that 3 national championships gave Bryant the social and political capital to pursue integration ahead of his conference rivals. Thus, while the rest of the Southeastern Conference allegedly lacked the leadership to pursue integration, Bryant would show them the way. As ESPN's 2002 9-hour multi-part documentary Rights of Autumn asserted in referring to Bryant, if change was going to come to the SEC, quote, it needed a leader. Writer Jack Clary declared, when a man of his stature said, let's do it, then it was done, and I think it helped the walls fall. Supposedly power enough to thus usher in integration, Bryant merely needed a rationale to do so. For these writers and commentators, the 1970 game emerges as Bryant's tipping point. While writer and television commentator Tony Barnhart's assertion that the 1970 game, quote, convinced Bear Bryant to begin recruiting black players is patently false, many insist that Bryant's role in the game reflected positively on Bryant's influence within the profession on the race question. Grambling University's legendary head coach Eddie Robinson asserted that the game changed Bryant, quote, and when Bryant decided to recruit black players, that opened the gates for other coaches to do so as well. Even critics of Bryant on the race question acknowledged that the role the game had played in his thinking. The esteemed columnist Frank DeFord asserted that Sam Cunningham and the USC game forced Bryant's hand, quote, only when it was evident that the Tide could not win any longer lily white. Only then did the Bear learn his civics. Among the pro-Bryant commentators, Bear's influence within college football was matched only by his racial egalitarianism. Defenders of Bryant highlight his impoverished upbringing in rural Arkansas as creating a deep and abiding sympathy for the underprivileged. One of his first black players, Sylvester Croom, provided the go-to reference for those seeking to assert Bryant's colorblindness. Coach Bryant didn't have black players and he didn't have white players. He just had players. To be sure, Bryant was no racist who had to be dragged kicking and screaming to integration. In 1965, he famously told Look magazine with a sense of anticipation that, quote, Negro players are coming to the Southeastern Conference. Such assertions, however, ignore that Bryant exhibited little actual leadership on the race issue. He once asserted that, quote, I won't be the first to integrate, but I won't be third either. In fact, 6 other SEC varsity teams were already integrated by the fall of 1970, and as Charles Martin had asserted, while the 1970 game may have had significance for Alabama's fan base, it was definitely not an expression of Bryant's leadership on the race question. Bryant's timid approach to integration raises one of many paradoxes within the legend and that confront these pro-Bryant interpreters of the 1970 game. If we're going to elevate Bryant to an exalted status, and that he was emphatic in his support for integration, then we've got to explain why he doesn't integrate sooner then. Such a paradox requires, in these popular histories, an anti-Bryant, someone to play the role of kryptonite to Bryant's otherwise superhero persona. Enter George Wallace as the villain of the story. Bryant had already established himself in Alabama when George Wallace won the first of his 3 non-consecutive terms as Alabama governor in 1962. In his 1963 inaugural, Wallace famously asserted, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Later that summer, he literally stood in the schoolhouse door at Foster Auditorium to block the integration of the University of Alabama. And Wallace's shadow loomed so large in the state that even after he was term limited in 1966, he managed to remain as a shadow governor by stage managing the election of his wife, Lurleen, as his replacement, and then managed to win the governor's mansion openly again in 1970. As Wallace's ugly racism came to represent for many the state of Alabama, Bryant became, in the words of one of his biographers, Keith Donovan, quote, a psychological antidote to the governor. While Wallace was outspoken and racist, Bryant was dignified and supposedly harbored integrationist sentiments. However, as David Briley has noted, Bryant, quote, was not the governor and would not cross the governor in a public manner. Bryant knew his limits. His power base extended over the football field, but not beyond that. In this construct, then, Bryant is forced to surreptitiously orchestrate the 1970 game to finally demonstrate how badly segregation was harming Alabama football. Author John Bacon asserts in the 2019 ESPN documentary series College Football 150 that without black players, Bryant realized, quote, we're going to start losing games. So he invites USC, and the game's got to be in Alabama. Travers describes Bryant as, quote, the sly fox who knew the concept of the superior white athlete was a myth that would soon explode, an event that now Bryant was for which he was preparing. Bryant had already recruited Wilbur Jackson, so while Bryant didn't need to be convinced, he did need to convince Wallace and his tub-thumping base, who still fondly remembered Wallace's infamous inaugural address. As Sports Illustrated framed the game in retrospect, there are those who believe Bryant scheduled that game intentionally at home to demonstrate to his fan base the necessity of integration. USC assistant coach Craig Fertig claims that when Bryant and USC coach John McKay met at midfield for the postgame handshake, Bryant, having just been decisively beaten in front of a home crowd by 3 touchdowns, was smiling and declared, quote, John, I just want to thank you for what you've done for me and for the University of Alabama. ESPN's Rights of Autumn neatly presumes this exact reading in Bryant's mind. The result, quote, was stunning and exactly what Bear Bryant wanted. Black players in front of an all-white crowd and against an all-white team ended segregation on the football field once and for all. Here, Travers' sly fox not only orchestrated the game, but did so knowing he was going to get beat and that USC's black players would be the decisive forces in the game, all to show why, if Alabama wanted to dominate college football again, these were the terms upon which it was going to happen. According to Sports Illustrated, the game convinced even the most diehard segregationist supporters of Wallace to accept an afterword to his segregation forever rant, quote, unless it costs us winning football games. In making Wallace and the racist element in Alabama the only check on the better angels of Bryant's nature, the legendary context for the 1970 game neatly addresses his inability or unwillingness to integrate earlier and turns the 1970 game into Bryant's masterstroke. Bryant's shrewd handling, indeed in some interpretations, outright manipulation of Wallace and the state's hardcore racists, Travers asserts that it was a seminal moment of change in American history, while Sports Illustrated named the game one of the 20 great tipping points on its 50th anniversary. Asserting that Bryant scheduled that game against USC to show the Bama faithful what they were missing and to smooth the way for the change that had to come. Perhaps the most outrageous myth from the game focuses on Bryant's supposed post-game behavior relative to USC's Sam Cunningham and its role in advertising Bryant's racial enlightenment and progressivism. The myth has Bryant come into the USC locker room after the game to congratulate head coach John McKay, but in the process ask if he could, quote, borrow Cunningham. Bryant then supposedly took Cunningham, dressed only in an undershirt and his football girdle, across the hallway into the Alabama locker room and had him stand on a bench. Bryant then allegedly announced to a team, "This is what a football player looks like. This is a man." Nobody in the Alabama locker room remembers the incident, and Cunningham himself has emphatically asserted that it never happened, declaring such a scenario, quote, absurd. Even Travers, the most sympathetic chronicler of the game and its benevolent racial implications, describes the story as, quote, malarkey. In the very next sentence, however, he says that the story is too good not to be true because of its essential accuracy. The spirit of Bryant's alleged words somehow changed hearts and minds in the South. In supposedly upholding Cunningham as the essence of a football player, Bryant in this version makes clear that black men are not just football players, but exemplary ones, putting his players on notice that this is the future of Alabama football. The myth ignores the superfluous nature of such a demonstration, as everyone already on the team would have known about Wilbur Jackson, and many of those players had played against black players in high school because the Alabama High School Association integrated by 1965. The myth also provides another opportunity for these popular histories to advertise Bryant's racial progressivism and his pioneering stature. Already aware of the quality of black football and the benefits of integration, the USC game finally gave him the opportunity to show others what he had always known. The anecdote also contains a bit of racialist voyeurism, complete with references to Cunningham's stripped-down attire. All versions of the event describe Cunningham as triumphantly depleted, in varying states of undress, yet flush with victory, calling forth the image of a glistening, heaving gladiator. John Papadakis' version wanders into the mildly erotic, remembering Cunningham, stripped of his shirt even, procured from a, quote, satisfied Trojan locker room. Bryant supposedly then parades him across the hallway so that his players, in Papadakis' words, could, quote, gaze upon Cunningham's brilliant black body still shining with sweat. And versions that assert that Bryant had Cunningham elevated on a bench or stool easily call forth imagery of an antebellum slave auction. So long as it remained within the context of the male-only sanctum of a locker room, here is a version of black masculinity acceptable to a white audience, indeed packaged for white consumption and even possibly white objectification. Finally, the anecdote contains a bit of repossessing of the territory won by the civil rights movement. Jim Crow segregation was always imbued with infantilizing and emasculating elements. The degrading insistence of racist whites to refer to blacks of any age as, quote, boy, racial lynchings that ended in the ritualized severing of the male victim's penis, and an exploitive labor system that put black males on the bottom of the wage labor scale, all deprived black men of the traditional expressions and social customs of Western masculinity. The rhetoric and performative elements of the civil rights movement often sought to overturn this aspect of American segregation. Activists embraced protest, particularly direct action and its attendant confrontation with white law enforcement, as expressive of a new black masculinity. These activists, particularly from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, often tallied their beatings and jailings as a badge of honor, quantifying their commitment to win back their racialized identity. Even outside of SNCC, activists saw confronting Jim Crow restrictions as a demand for human dignity and individual identity. In the 1968 Memphis garbage workers strike that ultimately claimed the life of Martin Luther King, the city's striking sanitation workforce challenged low pay and work conditions that deprived them even of proper restroom facilities, with picket signs that asserted simply but definitively, "I am a man." Thus, Bryant's mythical declamation of Cunningham's masculinity restores black masculinity in the white mind to its proper place, contained within the arena for a mostly white objectification and not on the streets seeking to overturn the racial order. No element of the 1970 Alabama game is more revelatory about its effort to reinterpret history than the assertion that it allegedly accomplished more than the civil rights movement. Someone, often attributed to former Alabama assistant coach Jerry Claiborne, declared in the game's aftermath, quote, "Sam Cunningham did more to integrate the South than Martin Luther King." Over the years, the quote's origins and specifics have proven malleable. John McKay claimed that it was Bryant that said it, and Bryant does include the reference in his autobiography, while others claim that it was uttered at the game that night by varying Alabama personnel. USC assistant coach Marv Goh began embellishing the remark sometime in the 1970s by rendering it as, quote, "Sam Cunningham did more to integrate the South in 4 quarters than Martin Luther King did in 20 years. But regardless of the specifics, it is a quote that every chronicler of the 1970 game mentions. Sports Illustrated asserted that Cunningham doing more than King, quote, overstates the case, but then suggested that Cunningham did at least as much as King. Quote, "Cunningham could not have spoken out against segregation any more forcefully if he'd been preaching from a pulpit." The quote allows chroniclers to elevate the game's importance as a climactic moment in the struggle for racial justice. Yeager avoids giving explicit credence to the quote, but essentially says the exact same thing by insisting of the game and Cunningham's performance as a definitive watershed event. Quote, "When Sam Cunningham and the rest of the USC Trojans showed Birmingham what an integrated team could do, they were part of a movement that was already taking place, whose inroads were already laid, but they were, it seems, the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. They helped to demonstrate what was previously, to many, just a theory, that athletes of color possessed talent that could not be denied or ignored." With even greater hyperbole and apparently no sense of embarrassment, Travers implies a single unbroken line from 1619 to 1970, seeing the game as, quote, "a demarcation point in American history. In the annals of civil rights, slavery, abolition, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, Jack Johnson, Jesse Owens, Joe Louis, Jack Robinson, Texas Western, John Carlos, Tommy Smith, the words and actions of Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, all of it had come down to this moment. This was the tipping point." I can't read that quote without laughing every time. Such painful assertions ignore the numerous demonstrations of black football talent in front of Southern white audiences that had taken place for more or less the last decade. Perhaps the most recent and germane example was the drubbing administered to Alabama, in Birmingham no less, by the University of Tennessee the previous year and their first black player, Lester McLean. According to Alan Barra, why history has chosen to ignore the Tennessee game and focus exclusively on the 1970 Alabama-USC game is a mystery. To say that Cunningham, even if just as the benefactor of those that came before him, successfully smashed integration, reveals a persistent effort on the part of many chroniclers to elevate the game's significance as a key milestone in college football's chapter of the civil rights movement. And such assertions can only be made by ignoring the evidence of other nearly identical scenarios. To his credit, Cunningham, until his death, bristled at the comparison to King. Quote, "After 45 years, it gets to be a little much," and declared such comparisons offensive. Cunningham's reticence stems from a truer understanding of the game's limitations and its innate meanings about where credit for profound social change was properly owed. Cunningham dismissed entirely the idea that the game affected any significant transformation in the white South. Quote, "That game didn't change how those white people thought of black people. Blacks were accepted because they could help their program win football games." Indeed, in an on-campus forum between Alabama administrators and activist students the following month, one student asked about the status of the lawsuit and the integration of the athletic department. Student Development Dean Job Thomas crudely responded, "After that Southern Cal games, we got to get some blacks." In addition to oversimplifying and overstating the game's role in achieving racial justice, the quote simultaneously reveals a lingering white resistance to acknowledging the necessity and accomplishments of the civil rights movement. Though the quote ostensibly lauds Cunningham, it is an assertion nested in the game's supposed significance in single-handedly integrating Southern college football. As a result, its credit is implicitly assigned to Bryant, who, according to legend, had orchestrated the game for the exact outcome that the quote implies. It is a quote that many opponents of the civil rights movement find appealing, as it diminishes the process by which racial equality forced itself onto a largely resistant Southern life. While Bryant's autobiography reveals a man who readily transitioned to integration, he also revealed himself, perhaps more than intended, as closer to the Southern white mainstream on the process of the civil rights movement itself. Though he welcomed black players, integration would occur on his terms, rejecting the direct action and judicial strategies of civil rights activists. Bryant resented having to sit for that deposition and in the lawsuit, and had no interest in a player, quote, showing up with a bunch of photographers and some big-talking civil rights lawyer, quote, to force equality upon the white consciousness of Southern college football. To view the 1970 game as having more success than any march or demonstration goes a long way in allowing opponents of the civil rights movement to tell themselves that racial change came on their terms. So exalted is Bryant by some that former Alabama assistant coach and later Auburn head coach Pat Dye is quoted in CBS Sports documentary on the subject as asserting that Bryant, quote, has a spot in Alabama like Martin Luther King does in the world. Such elevations of Bryant generally, and events like the 1970 game specifically, demonstrate a resistance to acknowledging the primacy of black struggle to the civil rights movement. According to historian Lane Demas, the USC-Alabama game is in a long line of white myths that serve to deny black people their agency in terms of changing America. The persistence of whites to focus on figures like Bryant create narratives in which it is ultimately white people who make cautious, thoughtful, calculating decisions to create change and integrate on their own terms. They become the agents of change, not Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, or the thousands who struggled in the streets. That quote, according to Demas, is not meant to celebrate Sam Cunningham. That quote is meant to denigrate Martin Luther King. Those who opposed the civil rights movement did not do so simply from racism or fear of an integrated society. Many also vehemently opposed the tactics and the process of the movement itself. Dismissing civil rights activists as outside agitators was an attempt to delegitimate them as having no claim on Southern affairs. Thus, to assert that Cunningham did more than King to integrate the South implies that for all the marching, all the protesting, all the insistence of freedom now, activists could have achieved the same thing without protest or disruptive challenge to Southern institutions had they just simply been patient. The ultimate point of the King-Cunningham myth, according to Demas, is, see, we didn't need any of that other stuff. Implications about racial justice delivered to the South became because of a football game. Changed white conscience deftly dismisses, because a football game changed white conscience deftly dismisses the violent resistance of white Southerners and their dismissal of civil rights demonstrators as un-American and communists. As David Halberstam wrote, and all the good old boys could later laugh and say old Sam Cunningham did more to integrate Alabama in 60 minutes than Martin Luther King ever did in 16 years. Making the game exemplary of Bryant's racial progressivism, or his ability to convert an otherwise resistant white fan base, reveals an interpretive insistence on locating the game's significance aimed almost entirely at whites. While the purveyors of the legend ignore it incompletely, scholars have noted that if the game was orchestrated at all, it was likely done for the benefit of hesitant potential black recruits. In Bryant's 1969 deposition, he acknowledged how Alabama's poor reputation in the national media affected recruiting. When questioned about the lack of clear success in recruiting black players up to that point, Bryant sheepishly acknowledged the difficulty of recruiting black players, quote, with the image we have here in Alabama. Alan Barra notes that in 1969, Bryant had already in fact offered scholarships to 3 black players, but they all chose to matriculate elsewhere. One Alabama assistant coach noted, I really think this is something Coach Bryant hadn't counted on. I think he figured that once he began offering scholarships to the best black players, they would forget all about George Wallace and just line up to come play for Alabama. But it wasn't that easy. The populist retellings of the game insist on interpreting the game as something bent to the will of Bryant and other whites and aimed at Southern whites, thereby ignoring the agency of black players and their families. This not only allows for a tidy papering over of how the state and the university were viewed by many blacks, but also how much more complex the process would be in redressing those ills. To simply say that Alabama football solved its racial history by scheduling USC that September night is to neatly ignore the intensity and cost of all that came before it and the lingering bitterness that resulted. Most commentators on the game assert, either directly or implicitly, that a fundamental outcome of the game was its positive effects on the Alabama white fan base. With Alabama's dismantling at the hands of USC's integrated squad, and Cunningham in particular, racialized opposition in these interpretations supposedly melted just as Bryant had foreseen. ESPN's 50th anniversary piece quotes Alabama quarterback Scott Hunter as having been engaged by a white service station attendant in Tuscaloosa shortly after the game, who claimed, quote, "I was at that game, and man, we got to get some of them back players." Likewise, Travis, who implies a literal spiritual conversion was at work, often includes similar quotes in both of his books that address the subject. He quotes John Mitchell, who transferred to Alabama for the following football season, overhearing Alabama fans outside the stadium that night claim, "Bryant needs some blacks of his own." While journalist Art Spander claims to have overheard Alabama fans on the Monday after the game in the Birmingham Holiday Inn, I bet Bear wishes he had some of them Negro boys. Ignoring the racially charged language, these quotes, presuming a degree of accuracy, stress the game's primacy in changing the mindset of many Alabama fans. Such quotes, however, are also revelatory of the dangers of the legend of the 1970 game. Told as they are in the wake of defeat, they are implied as prima facie evidence of the white South's racial conversion and their acceptance of integration. Read more carefully, they render in objectifying language the acquisition of black players for the sole benefit of winning football games and the emotional satisfaction of a predominantly white fan base. As a result, one of the more destructive elements of the legend surrounding the 1970 game is the easy conflation of accepting black players with accepting black rights. Having won over the fans in Legion Field that night and outmaneuvered George Wallace in the battle for the hearts and minds of the Alabama fan base, Bear Bryant, according to most interpretations, could now get back to winning football games. Yeager and Briley both see the game as representative of a definitive resolution to Alabama's racially hostile past. According to Yeager, quote, "The South, the nation, and the world were changing, and as Bryant moved with the inevitable progress, his players carved out an unforgettable, unquestioned place for him among college football's greatest. The tremendous records achieved by integrated teams ensured that there would be no turning back, no throwback to the days of a segregated Alabama team. Together, they proved true the old saying, 'Time and tide wait for no man.'" Such sentiments illustrate the legend's purveyance of the game as providing a neat and definitive break with the South's racialized past. The legend of the 1970 game posits it as an opportunity to move beyond old injustices and correct old wrongs, glossing over the numerous unsolved murders during the Civil Rights era, the lasting stain of massive resistance, the role of the white citizens' councils. In short, the game allowed white people to come to grips with integration on their terms in ways that benefited them emotionally. In discussing notions of right and wrong, it ignores entirely the black experience, presuming that now having been granted the ability to play integrated football in the South, the region's black players and their families would be happy to accept the opportunity and simply give the white South a pass on everything that came before the game. In the aftermath of the game, in Yeager's terms, and tellingly in the passive voice, amends were finally being made. Despite the rivalries and competitions, the American football nation was finally healed. The popular legend of the game creates a triumphalist narrative orchestrated by whites and intended to comfort white people. Supporters and defenders of Bryant find such narratives appealing because they elevate him as a mastermind, besting segregationist Alabama Governor George Wallace and giving credence to their desires to see Bryant on the right side of history. White Southerners, still defensive about the lionization of the civil rights movement and the extent to which the South faced condemnation for its racial past, appreciate implications that the game diminishes the accomplishments of Martin Luther King and the direct action phase of the civil rights movement. In every instance, these stories see the game as a clean and decisive departure from the South's racial past, represented by its location in Birmingham and its legacy of police dogs and fire hoses. It is a story with many heroes, but implicitly only one villain, the discredited ghost of George Wallace as stand-in for the Alabama and a South that no longer exists. As Michael Oriard has noted, quote, "The myth of the 1970 game makes the radical assault on one of the most powerful symbols of racist Southern ideology seem a single painless event." Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes for questions.
Hang on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so good. So you mentioned, I was struck by the line that the Alabama team accepted Black players without accepting Black rights.
Right.
Right. So I was curious, was the team actually ever able to recruit Black players? And if so, what was their policy? Did they still have discriminatory policies even when the team became integrated?
No. So once the team became integrated, and at that point they were already integrated with their freshman squad, this kid named Wilbur Jackson. And then within the microcosm of any college football program, particularly at that time, the head coach is basically, an authoritarian figure, and he can order whatever he wants. And in this regard, Bryant does deserve a fair amount of support, or what's the word I'm looking for? He does the right thing, because there's no evidence that there is any tension within the team once people like Wilbur Jackson and others begin to participate in terms of practice. The other thing, though, you have to keep in mind, by 1970, because of federal legislation, any university that was receiving federal funds also had to abide by elements of the Civil Rights Act. So even dorms, by this point, they were prohibited from segregating. So even had they wanted to persist in that, it would have really been a problem. But the real question, I think, that what you're getting to is the culture on the team. Yes. And Bryant essentially said, no, we're not going to allow those views. This is, everybody is on this team is equal.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to give everyone a chance. Okay, another question.
Sure.
So you mentioned how this is, how the myth about this game is a white narrative for white consumption, basically. But how is this actually received by Black audiences? And were there any Black reporters or anyone, was there a difference in perspective, or did they also feed into this narrative?
That's a great question, and pretty sophisticated that you picked up on this, because sort of this main narrative ignores entirely a third track that I also address elsewhere that is essentially how Blacks tell this narrative. And for them, it is also triumphalist. But what they claim is that this is the story that's missing in the white narrative. They forced this on white Alabama. In other words, even if that is not accurate relative to the facts, it is couched within the more traditional narrative of the civil rights movement, which was that Black people refused to stand down and forced this upon an sort of willing white fan base and white cultural milieu.
Yeah, so they basically thought the white team they weren't doing them a favor.
Right. Yeah, and there's a whole, there's quite a lot of evidence in which Black commentators, the lawyer, for example, that was involved in the lawsuit, he gives a lot of evidence. I'm almost gleeful in the way he retells some of his stories.
Well, we're out of time, I think, so maybe you can save it for after the talk.
I'll stick around.
Please join us again in thanking Dr. Kemper.
I have to say, you made me want to be a sports assistant.
Well, I was afraid I was going to go long.